We take a look back at game 2. It wasn't all bad for the Bucks. So what were some of the things that worked that they're going to continue to need to ride? The update of sorts on Giannis, what that could potentially mean for the remainder of the series, but more importantly, what went wrong and what do the Bucks need to adjust as this series shifts to Indianapolis? Camille and I take a look at that coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can also hear me on the Bucks Radio Network. She's Camille Davis. You can find her work, obviously, on Locked On Bucks on the Carry the G podcast and MKE, the Pack-A-Day podcast, the Technical Foul podcast, everywhere. And especially now that we sit here and record this the morning of day 1 of the NFL draft. So you'll certainly see a lot more Camille elsewhere these next couple of days. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts and viewable as well on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Monopoly Go. If you've got a competitive side, Monopoly Go is the game for you. The mobile hit twist on the classic Monopoly game. Join now with your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Camille, you and Frank broke down what we saw in game number 2 in real time and immediately afterwards on the podcast earlier this week. But I think what really stood out as we start to take a look at what do the Bucks need to make adjustments on. Game 2 is always the interesting game where you know what worked for you. And in the case of the Pacers, there wasn't a whole lot other than points in the paint, which is what they do. But there's always that uneasiness of, okay, let's see who's going to make the first adjustment. Rick Carlisle was asked about that before the game too of, I know throughout the course of the season, you've said, we're more focused on us, which all coaches will tell you, we're just focused on doing our thing. But do the playoffs change that at all? We really got a non-answer from Rick Carlisle, but the answer was clearly yes. And I think the message was, I don't know if it was the inexperience or what, but watching game 1 and watching game 2, it just felt like the Pacers were very tentative, that they weren't going to that extra gear. Maybe it was a young team that outside of Miles Turner and Pascal Siakam hadn't really experienced the playoffs. But, you know, in a broad sense, their big adjustment was simply, let's just play fast.
Yeah, I think that was the case in game 1. I think it was like, hey, it's the first playoff game. Like that experience difference between the Pacers and the Bucks, I do think shined through in that game because the Bucks came out understanding what they had to do, what the assignment was, and they did that. Meanwhile, the Pacers were making uncharacteristic mistakes at times. They weren't playing Pacers basketball. And like you mentioned, it was really Siakam that was keeping them in game 1 with his steady dose of scoring. He just didn't look phased throughout the entire game. And come game 2, you could see the rest of the team kind of felt that same level of confidence. At least that's how it looked to me watching the game. And that's something that really stood out because game 1, there was shots of Tyrese Halliburton looking like Haney on the sideline where it's like, oh, like you got knocked out of this particular game. But come game 2, you know, they were ready to go and they were playing Pacers ball. They were able to get out and transition a little bit more. They were able to run after makes, after misses the way they like to. And another piece of it that I thought was interesting, which Bobby Portis's post-game comments alluded to, was that whole emotional, the fact that these two teams don't like each other, right? And of course, we're going to talk X's and O's and strategy and things of that sort. But I do think that that emotional component is very important as well, because going into the playoffs, Dame was asked about this, Chris was asked about this, Bobby was asked about this, and they all had comments around the same of like, hey, the stakes are higher in the playoffs. We understand that, but we have to keep our composure. The team that, you know, gets too involved in the emotions game normally loses because you can get taken advantage of when you're really in your emotions. And then post game, you hear Bobby Portis saying, like, you know, they're a bunch of front runners. Like they talk a lot when they're up, when it's down, you don't hear nothing. almost last dance-ish of Bobby Portis. But like that's something going into game 3 where the Bucks are going to have to make sure that they're focused, especially given the fact that it doesn't seem as if Giannis is going to be playing. So Bobby Portis is again going to have to step up into a prominent role. And we know he's somebody who Doc Rivers has mentioned. He calls one of the instigators on the team along with Pat Bev, and how it's a very thin line. And now you're heading on the road to Indiana. Like you have to make sure that you are playing Bucks basketball, that you're focused on the goal at hand, which is to win the game in itself. Shake off game 2 and move on. Understand, hey, it's a game at a time. I don't care if the Bucks win by 1 or 25. It's about getting the win the way that you can in that particular game.
Yeah, and so that's one of the interesting things for me to keep an eye on in this game 3 is not just Bobby Portis, because his role has kind of changed. Obviously, with the Giannis injury, he's not a role player now at this point. He's a guy that you're going to lean on heavily. But when you look at that bench for the Bucks, and I don't, this isn't to just go up and down the list and say this guy was good, this guy was bad. But the Bucks, and I think they'd be the first to tell you, they did not get the production that they need from that second unit. Doc said after the game, Malik Beasley didn't have a good game, and that's why you saw him for only 10 minutes. We had talked about this leading into the playoffs of keep an eye on Malik Beasley, he could be an X factor of sorts. Maybe not so much in the he won you a game, but do we see the version of Malik Beasley that we saw in the regular season when these teams played? When, look, taking the defensive part out of it, he was still shooting 45% on his threes in those games against the Pacers and up until the All-Star break. Or do we see the guy that closed out the regular season and was removed from the starting lineup? And as you and I talked about, did not play in the back half of the playoffs for the Los Angeles Lakers. So I still thought and think he was going to be an X factor in that sense of what version are you going to get from Malik Beasley? And look, 2 games is not a huge sample size, but 2 games into the series, it has unfortunately trended towards the latter, that he has looked closer to the guy that you feared it would be, that wasn't on the floor in the playoffs for the Pacers. I've seen the comments in the chat today, on Twitter, everywhere about Jay Crowder. Jay Crowder did not have a good game. When you have him out there for 3 and D, you got to get at least one of those. And 0 for 2 on threes. I thought Doc Rivers, all things considered, did a good job of picking his spots where to use Jay Crowder, and saw this isn't a Jay Crowder game. He doesn't have it. Game 1, not so much either. And that was our question about this series too, with some of the personnel of the Indiana Pacers is, that's what makes this even more challenging. And we had talked about the fact that this isn't the same Pacers team, and it's not. They play a little bit slower than they did when the Bucks saw them in the regular season, but it's still much faster than the Bucks play and would want to play. But their personnel, I know they don't have quite as many guys on the perimeter with the trade of Buddy Hield, the injury to Benedict Mathurin. Pascal Siakam's not a good matchup for Jay Crowder, any of those other guys, really. So this was going to be an interesting challenge for the Bucks to not only get past a team that, in terms of matchups, it's probably not ideal with their personnel. And, oh, by the way, to do it with arguably the best player in the conference on the sidelines for at least a portion of this series. So that to me is really one of the big things moving into game 3 is that second unit. I thought AJ Green was fine, 5 points, missed the only 3 he took, and missed all of his threes, I think it was, in game 1. And Doc even joked about that after the game too, that he texts with AJ after the games and told him, look, this just means you're going to get even more looks. They're going to leave you open. And I do think there is still ripe potential for a big AJ Green game, and big in the sense of maybe 12 points, but a moment where AJ Green gets those looks and hits threes and really helps prop up that offense. Because that, to me, Camille, was the toughest part of that game. You let the Pacers dictate the pace and really from the get-go, right? Like, I remember looking up at the scoreboard at one point and seeing, I think it was 29-25, Bucks were up in the first quarter, but there was still like 5 minutes left, and thinking, oh man, this is this is not where you want to be. I know you're up now, but this is just playing into the hand of the Indiana Pacers. So it's going to be imperative to find more production. It doesn't have to be just scoring, but productive minutes from the second unit. I thought AJ Green was fine. I thought Pat Connaughton was really good. That was about it from the second unit. And maybe the Pacers didn't get huge impacts, but I thought really everybody that came in, for the most part, had a moment. I mean, Ben Shepherd hit 2 big threes for them. TJ McConnell, for whatever reason, only struggles against AJ Green. For everybody else, he still is a Bucks killer. And even Obi Toppin, not great, but he had some nice moments for the Pacers. So I put this back at you. That, to me, is maybe the most important thing about Game 3, because unfortunately, role players tend to play better at home than on the road.
They tend to play better at home than on the road, and they can be the ones who really swing a series as well. And I want to talk a bit more about this on the other side of the breaks. I know that's coming up, but the role player conversation is really interesting. Like, I was actually shocked during Game 2 when Bees came in. He didn't have good minutes at the beginning. He got pulled, and we didn't see Bees again until it was garbage time for the most part, where I was like, okay, Doc's not afraid to say, hey, this particular game, it's not working. We're going to go in a different direction. And that's something with Doc Rivers where I wasn't sure if he'd be that type of coach in these situations. But again, when you're missing Giannis, that's a big hole to try to fill. And Bobby Portis now moved into that starting lineup. So that's a lot of your bench scoring, your bench power now insert into the starting lineup. So it's like, who else can step up for the Bucks during these minutes? And you mentioned AJ Green. In Game 1, of course, he was 0 for 3 from 3. Those were his only 3 shots, but they were all good looks. He just didn't happen to knock him down. Game 2, he was 2 of 4 from the field, didn't get his 3, but a couple of times, the 2 buckets he did make, he was driven off the 3-point line, found a little mid-range jumper and made that. And that's something that we haven't seen a lot of from AJ Green, because you think of him as pretty much like, hey, he's a 3-point shooter. He's a 3-point shooter. He has
catch and shoot 3-point
catch and shoot. Yeah, you don't think of him taking it off the dribble, getting into a mid-range jumper. So like, that's something that can also help him if defenses do start to play him a little bit tighter on that 3-point line. But Pat Connaughton, you mentioned, had a good game, which I agree with. Jay Crowder is really interesting, because it's like, if this is a matchup where he doesn't work, like, what matchup will Jay Crowder really work well in, is a question that I have as well. Like, the big rotation in particular, because Doc has gone really small against the Pacers as well. Like, we've seen Chris Middleton at the 4 alongside Bobby Portis, which doesn't scream rim protection, but it does scream like, hey, at least we can get back. Like, we have some guys who can run a little bit more flexibility in that way. So I do want to ask you just a little bit about that as well. Like, the big rotation and then some of the role players, and then going into Game 3, which guys, like, how short might the leash be for some guys? And also, which guys need to play better? Like, you mentioned the fact it's not all points. Part of what made Pat Bev, who's a starter, so crucial in Game 1 wasn't the points. Like, Game 1, he only scored, 5 points in Game 1? But it was the fact he had 7 rebounds. He had 8 assists. Game 2, he had 5 points, but he only had, 3 assists, 4 rebounds. Like, that's really big for these types of guys in these games, where it's like, we're not counting on you necessarily do all the scoring, but we are counting on you to do a little bit of everything else that is going to help this team.
Yeah, and I thought Pat Bev was fine, right? Defensively, it was a physical game. At times, he was able to get away with some things. We are not a blame the officials podcast or show. There were some bad calls, but it was inconsistent, because, if we look back at that Dame foul, that seemed pretty egregious. The shooting foul where Dame was getting out of the way. It is worth pointing out, moments before that occurred, Pat Beverly just shoved Tyrese Halliburton out of the action right in front of Tony Brothers, and did not get a whistle. So I saw a lot of those complaints too. It was inconsistent. It wasn't bad slanted towards one team or the other. But look, the Bucks are going to want a physical style of game, but they're going to have to bring that to the table. So you mentioned some of those things to continue to take a look at with those role players and the pace of the game. We will do that coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, passion, drive, and patience. That is the formula for winning championships. And that is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to constantly turn down the volume due to all of that shouting? Well, if so, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Camille, taking a look at some of the interaction. We'll get back to those points we referenced before, but I see a lot of people chiming in about the calls being terrible and on both sides, which again is what we were kind of alluding to. But this one is what struck me the most from Q. Who on the Bucks roster is most likely to be the 2024 Bryn Forbes? I would assume you mean a supernova in one series and then just kind of fades away for the rest of the playoff run. I mean, to me, I think it's pretty clear it's AJ Green. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I would go with AJ Green because you look at the options, right? And this is looking at the team without Giannis in the starting lineup. That means your bench options to be that Bryn Forbes type of guy. You got Jay Crowder, you have Pat Connaughton, you have Malik Beasley, you have AJ Green. And those are the four who've really played. I don't think we're going to see a lot of Danilo Gallinari, Chris Livingston, Thanasis. And I mean, of course, there are going to be calls for Marjan and Andre because that has been the call throughout the season. And we've talked about exactly why that is. Younger bodies who can move, athletic, fast, quick. They have a lot of characteristics that you would think would be useful on a team that Doc Rivers himself has mentioned, old and slow. Like we are not trying to get into a track meet. It's just that I don't know if he is going to pull the Marjan and Andre card in the playoff series, at least for enough minutes for them to be able to make a really large impact. Like Andre Jackson Jr. was somebody I thought might be thrown in 5 minutes or so in a spell. Just to kind of see like, okay, what can you do defensively really quick? Like, how can we get the energy up? But AJ Green seems to be that guy who has earned a little bit more minutes to be able to kind of get out there and make an impact in that way. He had 6 minutes in game one. Game two, he had 15 minutes. And part of that, like we mentioned, was he saw that B's like, hey, this isn't going to work. We're going to go a different direction. So that's a guy who I think it could be. And not a role player avenue. Like I thought in game two where it's like Brook Lopez made 6 threes and we lost the game where Brook Lopez made 6 3-pointers. Like that.
And Dame had 6.5 again.
Exactly. Like Dame and Brook combined for 12 3-pointers. And I believe the only other person who made a 3 was Chris Middleton. Like if we just have a couple of guys like hit those shots, because when you're a role player, you're not going to get a lot of them. It's about making the timely shots. And that's what the Bucks are going to need. Like you can't have Jay Crowder going 0 for 2 from 3, Pat Connaughton 0 for 1. B's only got up 1-3 during his limited period of time. And without Giannis, I think that 3-point advantage is going to be something that the Bucks really do have to lean on in this series against the Pacers.
That's the other tough part is you can look at the box score and say, man, they shot 41% on threes. It wasn't like it was a poor shooting night. Basically matched what the Pacers did. You went 13 of 32. Indiana went 16 of 36. You shot 41%. They shot 44%. Like these are games that you kick yourself when you say, we're right there with them in 3-point shooting. Points in the paint started to balloon in the second half when the lead did. But as you mentioned, the big part to to dig deeper on that 3-point shooting was, yeah, the Bucks were 13 of 32. Dame and Brook were 12 of 20. So everybody else was 1 of 12. And to that point, even if it's 5 minutes that we see Malik Beasley, he's got to take more than 1 3. Like, that's what we're having you on the floor. Malik Beasley and AJ Green in 25 combined minutes, 2 3-point attempts. You just need to see much more than that. You need both of those guys taking 3 to 4 threes in this game. Even Pat Connaughton only took 1, and that was kind of the story. Bobby Portis, we talked about his shooting during the regular season against the Pacers and how that would determine what the Bucks were able to do, because Bobby and Brook struggled with their efficiency in this series. Brook has played pretty good in these first 2 games. I know people have kind of mentioned how he looked slow and tired defensively. Again, he was not put in a good spot defensively, that this kind of drifted back towards what we were seeing in those regular season games. And I thought it wasn't just the pace that the Pacers played at in moving up and down the floor. The other big part to me was early in the game. We already talked about the score and how that was starting to get out of hand. Of, this is too much points. This is the pace the Pacers want to play at. But watching some of those sets that the Pacers were running, there was just much more movement in that first half, especially of guys running east and west without the ball and constantly moving. You didn't see as much of that in game number 1, where that Pacers team, I don't know if it was playoff jitters or what, they just came out and looked tentative. There wasn't as much of that. They did it in game 2, and I think fatigue was a big factor, and that tired out an older team. So in that sense, 2 days off in between games 2 and 3, I think would be an advantage for the Bucks. Does that mean they're going to win the game? No, you still need all those things that we described. You need some role players to step up. You need more threes. And the other part of this, game 1, I'm not saying you just punt on points in the paint, but in game 1, you did a good job of at least minimizing the damage, where you nearly matched the Pacers. They're very good at scoring in the paint. It got out of hand in game 2, and that's the way that Indiana does not need to hit a high percentage of their threes, is they're getting dunks and layups and scoring around the rim.
And they're content with taking those mid-range shots. Like, Siakam lives there. And a lot of the shots that Siakam's take, he's just shooting over people. Like, he's getting to his spot. He doesn't really care about what's in front of him. He's just going up at a comfortable spot on the court for him, and he's getting his shot up. I think the piece about the Bucks and Malik Beasley and AJ Green needing to take more than, a combined 4 to whatever, how many 3-pointers, that we need each of them taking 3 to 4 in a game. In addition to that, they have to be the right 3-pointers. Like, we saw with Bees, I believe it was game 2, where he came in, kind of took a really quick step back 3 early in the shot clock. Pacers go off and run the other way right after that. Like, again, Doc's talked about it a lot with this playoff series, and even just during the regular season with this team, and that is that the Bucks have to have good shot discipline. Like, you cannot take bad shots, because they're going to get out and run after the miss. Yep. They run after makes. So, if you miss, they're going to get out and run as well. That's the thing with Brook Lopez as well. Like, I see a comment just saying, like, Brook needs to be in the paint and fight for offensive rebounds. There were a few times in game 2 where either he missed the layup or he was trying to get the board. They didn't get it, and the Pacers are off and running, and it's 5-on-4, because it's going to take Brook a little bit longer to get from one basket down to the other basket, which put the Bucks in a disadvantageous situation. So, like, that's the thing with this Pacers team as well. Like, the shot discipline has to be there, but also on defense, your discipline has to be there. Like, if you're not supposed to be crashing, you need to get back. You can't stay back, complain to the ref. You can't try to swipe at the ball. You just have to get back, because you know what they're trying to do. They're trying to catch the Bucks defense off guard and unset. So the Bucks have to do everything in their power to get back as quickly as possible to try to set up that defense and communicate as well. Like, it's on Twitter now, the dunker spot highlighted it, the transition bucket where Chris and Bees are back, and Chris is like pointing very hard, like, over here, pick up Halliburton, pick up. No one picks him up, and Chris is just looking at, like, what is happening? Like, the communicate, you can't have those breakdowns in the playoffs against a team like the Pacers. So, like, there are things for the Bucks to clean up on their own. In addition to that, they have to just kind of knock down some shots. As simple as that sounds, like, You got to knock down some shots. You got to get back. You have to play tight defense. You have to have each other's back because the Pacers are putting them into a lot more scramble situations. They're trying to bend that defense. How long can you stay connected? How long can you make sure you have the right rotation when you are trapping? Like, you have to play some smart basketball, and it requires a lot of effort, communication, and hustle to do that.
Yeah, and you saw a frustrated Brook Lopez quite a bit too. Same story as you mentioned with the Chris thing of Brook pointing out and just aghast, throwing his hands up in the air of where was the help there. And there was a couple of instances too of Doc, to that point you made before about you got to get back. Of I think one was Dame, one I believe was Pat Beverly. A couple of times where Doc noticeably on the sidelines was having to walk onto the floor and say, guys, go, stop complaining, get down the floor and get set. And that's the other thing is it's almost a catch-22 because, there's been a lot of calls for this on social media in the chats today too, about you got to play Brook around the basket and we got to be the bigger team and more physical team. And I certainly think there's a lot of merit to that. I mean, look, that's how they beat the Atlanta Hawks. This Hawks team is much different from this Pacers team. But I think the danger there is, we saw, I think 3 times in the game 2, and this was 3 straight possessions in the second half. Brook Lopez missed at the rim. One, I believe, was a Dame missed reverse layup, and then Jay Crowder missed a shot at the rim. On all 3 of those, like, that is your biggest enemy when you play a team that is as fast as the Pacers, because point guards and bigs, when you miss at the rim, it is almost gift wrapping a fast break on the other end. And that's what we saw on 3 straight possessions. I believe 2 of them resulted in an and one because the Bucks didn't have the help back. Pacers were already down the floor. You're in a precarious spot. They get the field goal and a foul. And that's the challenge. And that's, I'm sure, what the Bucks are weighing of, look, we know Brook can knock down these shots. 6 3-pointers, a career high for a playoff game. We know he can score around the rim, but if he misses a 3, yes, that's going to kickstart some transition on those long rebounds, but he's also closer to midcourt and able to get back defensively.
Yeah, and I think that's a big piece of it as well. Like, the Bucks can win this, like, it's a game at a time. And a lot of the reaction after game 2 was a lot of, whoa, like the Bucks are done. It's a complete flip from what you saw after game 1, where it's like, oh, the Bucks are here. Like, we ready. Like, yeah, glow. Like, all the different things you saw after game 1 come game 2 with a different vibe. But it has to be remembered that it's a game by game series. Like, you have to take it a game at a time. Come game 3, what are some things that the Bucks can focus on to try to get a win? Like, you're just thinking about game 3. You're not even at this point thinking like, hey, we got to get one here. Like, it's just about game 3. You focus on game 3, and then once that's over, you focus on game 4. So then the question now is, heading into Indiana, heading onto the road here, series tied 1-1. What are the things that you have been doing that are working? And what are some things that you need to clean up in order to try to win this game? And there's a couple of things the Bucks have been doing well in this series. And you saw it, of course, a lot more in game 1 than you did in game 2. But like the blueprint is still there for this team to come out of this series victorious.
Those things we'll take a closer look at in what has worked well for the Bucks, besides the obvious in just Damian Lillard. But we'll get a look at the positives. It's not all negative. It's still 1-1 here. And hey, the 1 seed in the East is currently in a 1-1 series with the 8 seed, a spot the Bucks know all too well against that same opponent. So we'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is sponsored by BetterHelp, and sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who is unbiased on your life. So today I want to talk to you about how I really feel about something, and that is the Brook Lopez slander. As we just went through in the previous segment, I think a lot of times it's easy to point to Brook Lopez and see, hey, got beat by his man or got beat at the rim. Brook Lopez is old. He's aging. He's slow. The Bucks need to move on and find other ways to attack down low, when in reality there's more to it. There are little things along the way that add up to the finished product, just as you would experience in your life in any area of your life. That's where BetterHelp can be of assistance. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than the Bucks' record against the Indiana Pacers. Will they come out of the first round of the playoffs? But it's important to get those things and concerns off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It is designed to be flexible, and most importantly, it's suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/LockedOnNBA, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That site again is BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. And now time to talk to you about DoorDash. If you want to make your mom smile, start Mother's Day with flowers or surprise her with gifts from the brands she loves delivered the very same day with DoorDash. Moms are a gift, so give her the best gift of all this Mother's Day. A gift as thoughtful as she is. With DoorDash, you can select from hundreds of expertly crafted bouquets to the best of each. Self-care essentials, tech, anything you can think of, all of it delivered right to mom's door. This Mother's Day, get something thoughtful for mom on DoorDash. Surprise her from wherever you are with fresh bouquets and everything else. It's never too late to show your mom the love on Mother's Day with DoorDash. So act now. Get your mom your Mother's Day gifts all in one place. 50% off your next order, up to $15 when you spend 15 or more on your next flour, convenience, grocery, or retail order now with the code LOCKEDONNBA. That is LOCKEDONNBA. Order that using DoorDash today with that code. Terms apply. Get a Mother's Day gift as unique as she is with DoorDash. Again, that code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, for 50% off your next order, up to $15 when you spend $15 or more on your next flour, convenience, grocery, or retail order now on DoorDash. All right, Camille, what is working for the Bucks is clearly Damian Lillard. And
Big work.
Look, all of the questions, and I suppose you could say concerns that some Bucks fans had coming into the playoffs. And in fairness, we did not see a very consistent version of Damian Lillard during the regular season. There's a lot that goes into that, but it wasn't what Bucks fans had envisioned when this trade went down. 2 games into this first round series, it has been what you envisioned. And I thought in game one, as you and Frank talked about, you can point to 35 points in the first half, none in the second half. But the way he played in the second half, to not force things, to not say, hey, I'm going off for 60 and I'm really making a statement in my Bucks playoff debut, to concede to Chris Middleton and the open man, that to me was important. And, we saw the same thing or similar things in game 2, 26 at the half. I think he only had 8 in the second half, but still picked his spots. It was more of the team issues that the Bucks ran into in those final 24 minutes. It's still something that I'm sure the Bucks are working on daily. He looked more comfortable with some of those traps and doubles that the Pacers were throwing out there. Still areas that the Bucks overall need to be better at, because I would imagine that's the biggest thing they're going to see for the duration of this series. Dame at least looked more comfortable, but again, it's something you got to keep working on as this series progresses.
Absolutely. Like, the pressure in the second half of game 1 was what really shifted. And I was like, oh, I think game 2, they're going to just come out immediately and try to apply that pressure. And they did. I mean, they were picking up Dame 94 feet, even double teaming him, just trying to get the inbound, where it's like, that's interesting. Like, they're really like anybody but Dame. And the Bucks have to be able to find additional ways to continue to keep Dame involved with that type of pressure. Like you said, I love that Dame didn't push he didn't push it. He didn't force it. And Dame himself even mentioned after the Magic game to close the regular season about when he kept kind of ending up in one-on-one situations against Isaac, where he's like, look, I'm a hooper. Like, I'm a scorer. Like, I know I'm a bucket. And sometimes it doesn't really matter who's in front of me. I'm going to try it because I know who I am. And having that discipline of saying, like, okay, is this the best shot? Let me try to see what else we can get out here. And doing that facilitation, I think, was really big for the Bucks in the first 2 games. But A huge difference between game 1 and game 2 were the non-Dame minutes, right? Game 1, you saw the Bucks go plus 21 with Dame on the bench, and that was not the case in game 2. I think a large part of that had to do with the first quarter, just the rotations kind of getting thrown off a bit with the Chris Middleton ankle injury that happened there. Things were kind of just not the same rotation or pattern or flow we saw in game 1. So trying to get that back on track. And those non-Dame minutes again in game 3 are going to be really big for this Bucks team to try to not, I'm not saying that they're automatically going to have a lead with Dame on the court, but when he's not on the court, given the fact of how dynamic he has been offensively, like the Bucks are going to have to at least not lose big in those non-Dame minutes. So that's something in game 3 to keep an eye on. In addition to that, I mean, we mentioned just the getting back, the transition, the shot discipline, the things that we've been saying going into the series. They have to continue to make sure that they're playing with the right effort and energy there. And I do think them having the 2 days off in between is very helpful for this particular Bucks team. Having a week off of them coming into game 1, they looked really good. I was wondering how they might bounce back in game 2 after being beat up a little bit. I mean, you even saw in game 2, Pat Connaughton getting pushed out the air, grabbing his knee, Chris Middleton spraining the ankle. Like, guys are getting up slow. It's playoff basketball. The bodies are hurting. So how much can they play through that in game 3 as well? So yeah, I think the non-Dame minutes are going to be really important. Chris Middleton is going to be really important for that reason. We talked about the role guys who need to show up as well, and other guys to kind of knock down their shots. Like I mentioned, you might not get a lot of them, but you have to make some timely shots against this Pacers team. And then there's the Siakam problem, which I was saying initially, like if they want to run their entire offense through Siakam and we're settling for like the 2s and mid-range and slowing the pace down, I can live with that. But you can't do that and also have them cooking behind the 3-point line or also having some other guys making timely shots for the Pacers.
He was much more of a facilitator and getting the offense involved in game 2. And that was the issue, because I agree. And we talked about that coming in too, is early into game 1, when you saw the matchup of Brook waiting for Pascal Siakam to cross midcourt, I think initially you thought, I don't know about this. And then it became kind of clear of, I think this is strategy. If this is the matchup, we know he's going to attack. We want that. And the Pacers playing in the half court rather than them just pushing it and getting in transition. There were a couple of times in game 2 as well where one of the dangerous parts about the Pacers transition is when it's not Tyrese Halliburton that's leading it, when Tyrese is the first guy to sprint down the floor and get set, where they can push it. And then you have the point guard in Halliburton waiting down there to get the ball and attack a big that gets back for the Bucks. And we saw that a lot more in game 2. So to me, look, I know it's in some ways kind of a cop-out to say, but like ultimately it is on the Bucks. That's the biggest adjustment, as we heard Doc Rivers hammer home after game 1 and again in much greater detail after that game 2 loss. It's the offense. We have to put our defense in a better spot. If you're twisting around and pivoting and looking for a shot, that means you got to pass. You're not taking that shot. You have to know about where you're spacing the floor and not putting your defense in a bad spot with your offense. So cleaning up on that is going to go a long way in dictating the pace of this game. We know the Pacers are going to run on makes, but the Bucks were basically giving them a head start on a lot of those possessions. So I think that is going to be a big piece. And, I don't have an answer on what you do in terms of the style that you play. If it's, we're just going to beat this team up and be the physical team as they were in game 1.
They were.
And we see a closer version of what we saw in those final 2 games against the Atlanta Hawks in the conference finals, or if it's a recognition of, look, we just can't do that, right? Like we already saw Doc basically concede for large stretches of game 2. We just got to play smaller. And that means Brook Lopez is off the floor. And that's the other challenge with trying to play bigger against this team and be more physical, is you also have to be cognizant of the split in minutes between Brook and Bobby, because that is all you have for big. So you can't just say, okay, we're going to go attack them here and load up for these first 10 minutes, because either Brook or Bobby has to come off the floor and get some rest and then replace the other, and vice versa. So I think the last point for me is, well, look, it's clear. We all know you have to slow down the Pacers. You can't play at this pace. If the scores are in the 120s, I don't think it's going to bode well for the Bucks. As crazy as that is to say at a team that has Damian Lillard, they're going to have to win games that are 110 to 105. That's how you're going to have to beat this Indiana Pacers team, and their offense is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't, like, this isn't super exciting to say, but the Bucks have to just play better. Like, you have to play better. Like, you understand what your game plan is. You need to have that discipline. You need to have game plan discipline, shot discipline. You have to understand your limitations and try to go and play towards your strengths. And you mentioned the physicality, which I think is a big piece of it, because game 2, the Pacers were the more physical team. They were taking it to the Bucks. And when you're the aggressor, a lot of times the calls are going to go in your favor as well. So the Bucks have to do that. And you mentioned the Brook Bobby split, which is important because, I mean, the Bucks were out rebounded by the Pacers in game 2, I believe by 4 or 5 rebounds in that particular game. I think Bobby was the only Buck in double figures, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Like like that's the trade-off as well when you're going smaller. And if you are going smaller, whoever that nominal power forward is in that lineup, they're going to also have to do their job as well when it comes to the defensive glass and trying to end the possession, because you don't also want to give the Pacers second opportunities to go back at it again. The Bucks just have to play better. They have to have that discipline, the shot discipline, game plan discipline, and even emotional discipline as well. If things aren't going your way, don't complain to the refs. You get back. Like, you have to stay focused on the object at hand, which is trying to win the game.
Yeah, and I just, as we wrap up here, I do want to just point out one thing, is it seems like the common thread in the chats today is the young guys in MarJon and Andre Jackson Jr. We touched on AJ Green. As we said a number of times, Camille, I just, you can't put your hopes on that. We're not going to see it. I mean, MarJon Beauchamp has played 9 minutes in the playoffs in these 2 seasons now that he's experienced it. 3 games he's seen action, and one of them was garbage time just the other night. So you don't go from 9 minutes to all of a sudden, hey, we're in a tough spot. We need somebody to really infuse something here and lean on a guy like MarJon Beauchamp. And look, I think the other part of it is with Andre Jackson Jr., I certainly am open to him finding a way to carve out 4 or 5 minutes, right? As we talked about when we previewed this series. The challenge is, as we just talked about, floor balance and spacing and loading up your offense to put your defense in a good spot. We haven't seen that from Andre Jackson Jr. And not only that, you give the Pacers an advantage to say, here's one guy you don't have to worry about. Like, if Andre Jackson Jr. has an open look in the corner, they're going to let him take it. They're going to let him take anything that he wants. So that's the challenge there. And look, I know the only way to get experience is to play. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. But that's unfortunately where it's at for the young guys, that I don't think this is the series to see that. Like, if you're going to get them that experience, you wait for the series to be out of hand, and okay, now we can play you for 5, 6, 7 minutes so you can experience the playoffs. But in these spots, maybe not must win in a game 3, but that's not where you just turn to a guy that had played a total of 9 postseason minutes. And look, as much as we love MarJon, has been inconsistent and has some flaws that are not going to help this team in the long run, at least in this series, I should say.
Yeah, and it's also, I don't know if difficult, I guess difficult might be the right word to use here, just given the fact that Doc did come in mid-season, and to his own admission, he wasn't as familiar with the game of those younger guys, and he's been learning through practice about what they can do, and it's not as if they've had a lot of time to practice either. It just doesn't feel realistic to expect MarJon or Andre to come in, like you said, for 10, 15 minutes in a playoff series when, I don't want to say Doc doesn't trust them, but he doesn't have that familiarity with them yet. There are guys.
Look,
on the
no coach trusts a young guy. It's not just
Right.
Doc. It's just about every coach. You don't trust a young guy in these spots.
unless you've seen something. Like normally during the regular season, like you have those moments where you're like, you've built up trust, which is why I think it is AJ Green who we have been seeing, because over the regular season, we've seen him come in and contribute in a small dose of minutes. So like he has that going for him. Whereas with Andre and Marjon, that hasn't happened yet. Like it doesn't feel realistic to say like, that's what the Bucks need in this series to win it. Like they're going to have to get it done with who they currently have. And there's a blueprint for them to be able to do that. They just have to stick to that blueprint. And then also, I mean, basketball is a game of makes and misses. Like you got to make your shots and make sure the shots you're getting are the highest quality on each possession and in every single time down, which over a course of 48 minutes can get draining. So it's like you have to continue to have that discipline. So I don't know, Justin, it's going to be interesting to see how game 3 shakes out. But like we mentioned, I think the Bucks have enough to be able to do it. But it's a game at a time, and it starts on Friday.
Starts on Friday. It is a big one. Exact same spot the Bucks were in last year, although the caveat being they lost game 1 and won game 2, but also similar in the sense that Giannis missed essentially games 1 through 3 in that series last year. He played just under 10 minutes, I think, in game 1. Missed game 2 and 3. Doesn't appear as though he's going to be playing tomorrow to answer the questions that have come in there. So it seems like it's another game that you're going to have to play and try to win without Giannis. But as both of us have said from the onset, the approach for this series, it has to be, how do we beat the Indiana Pacers team without Giannis? What do we have to do without him in this series? If we get him back, great. But we have to game plan for beating this team without him. Camille and I will be back again tomorrow to preview that game number 3. Maybe we'll have a little more clarity on Giannis and some other developments out there. And as we mentioned, the Boston Celtics unfortunately lost last night. You hate to see it in game number 2 of their series. We may be headed towards wrapping up a lot of series tonight that we can get into, as the Cavs and Knicks both have a chance to go up 3-0. So we'll take a look at those on tomorrow's show as well. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.